Hi, everyone, and welcome back to SFC's Food for Thought series. For those of you who are just seeing SFC for the first time, we're an advocacy group made by students and young professionals for students and young professionals. We believe that Canada can have a strong future in resources, the economy, and the environment. Please feel free to connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. All of them are at Students for Canada if you want to learn more about what we do. Today, we are hosting Cody Battershill. Cody is a Calgary-based realtor as well as the founder of Canada Action. He's a spokesperson for Canada Action and argues that Canada is the most politically and socially stable oil-producing nation. Cody believes that a balanced conversation must be achieved and that it is important to lead the way by example. Before I hand over the floor to Cody, please note that attendees are encouraged to ask questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A box below, and we will address all of these at the end of the session. If you're watching live or if you're watching the recording, our word of the day is the Calgary Flames. If this is mentioned at any point, please DM our social media team on Instagram to be entered in a chance to win a t-shirt. All right, I'm going to share the spotlight now with our guest. Welcome, Cody. Thank you so much for joining us. If you would like to share your screen, please feel free at any time.
I hope everyone's doing great today. Thanks so much for having me. Flames are going to win tonight. Oilers are going to win tomorrow. Leafs are going to win tomorrow. Go Canada, go. And yeah, thanks again for having me. I hope you guys can see my screen. Awesome.
Looks great.
So today we're going to talk about the importance of energy advocacy. And it's very important. It's important that all things in life, we're having balanced, reasonable, respectful, positive, realistic, pragmatic, approachable conversations. It's important our opinions are based on facts and balance and a larger understanding of the issues at hand. It's important that we don't take the bait, so to speak, with a lot of these really important and emotionally charged conversations. We all want to protect the environment. We all want to protect our families and our futures. We all want to protect animals, protect the earth. We have to balance all of those important things with how we are all living and the things we want to do each day. The reality is every single thing human beings do has an environmental impact, and it's about mitigating, managing, reducing, innovating, protecting, collaborating to manage that impact as much as possible. We can all make our own personal decisions. We can make decisions at the municipal level, the provincial level, the national level, and the global level. And I am a big proponent of supporting what Canada's done, having a more balanced conversation about Canada's record. And ultimately, I'll make the case that the world needs more Canada in it, more Canadian resources, more Canadian know-how, more Canadian expertise, and to be honest, to copy our standards and our way of doing business and our way of innovation and collaboration and our way of responsible resource production to protect the environment. So I'd like to start today with this image you see here, Stop Financing My Doom. And it's been a big and very, again, emotional conversation for the last decade about, you know, divesting of fossil fuels and don't finance fossil fuels. And hey, my bank, you better not finance fossil fuels. And what this photo says is that people are very concerned about the environment, and we all are, but we need to understand what's happening around the world and what the bigger picture is. If we stop financing fossil fuels in Canada, does that stop financing fossil fuels in the entire world? The answer is no. Does it mean that companies leave Canada to do business elsewhere? Yes. And do other jurisdictions have the same standards? No. So is it a win for the environment? No, it's not. It's actually worse for the environment. People are very well-meaning, but a lot of opinions are based on a less than balanced understanding of what's actually happening around the world. When we look at our current society, steel, cement, ammonia, plastic. These are four fundamental building blocks of modern day society. And we could live without computers. The world was very advanced pre-computers. We could live without the internet, without social media, without cell phones, without laptops. We could live without TV. People did it. But those four things I mentioned, those are the underpinnings of modern civilization. Currently, fossil fuel generated fertilizer, ammonia-based synthetic fertilizer, is feeding about half of the world, almost 8 billion people. That's creating enough food for about 4 billion people. Steel, cement, plastic. Hospitals are almost entirely dependent upon plastics, advanced plastics, modern medicine, our homes, our food production, our food supply, our food transportation, water treatment. You just think at a very basic level, our roads, our sidewalks, lights. There's just all these things are based around raw materials and fossil fuels. And when we look back at fossil fuel share of global energy supply, 1970, 2017, 2040, even in 2040, if that number is 70% or 65% or even 60%, this is a much higher total supply, total demand. So even though the number is going down, the actual total isn't, because the world's going to forecast that the world could double energy consumption in the next 25, 30 years as more people around the world seek to live a quality of life and with modern comforts that we all enjoy and take for granted. My grandma grew up on a farm with no utilities. Some of her sisters died from diseases that today are preventable. And when we think just about how far we've come in a couple generations, it's remarkable. And a lot of that is based around modern technology and our modern ability to use natural resources. Very specifically, oil and gas, fossil fuels are a huge part of that. And I am pro all energy, but we have to be honest and pragmatic as we support more wind and solar. We can't forget about the investment in oil and gas so we don't have supply shortages, or so we're not dependent upon countries that do not share our values for protecting innocent women, children, civilians, and people, human rights in general. And we see that right now in the world, and it's really sad. So I am a big proponent of more balance, more respect, reducing polarization, being inclusive, listening to how other people feel, trying to find some common ground so that we all can share in a constructive conversation about an inclusive strategy going forward for the world. Maintain our living, our standard of living, support others in other countries that want to increase their standard of living, reduce environmental impact. That ultimately means more Canadian energy, more Canadian resources. There's no other way around it. And that previous slide that you saw, and other things that have been going on. I mean, here's Greenpeace talking about how great it is that the IEA is calling for the end of fossil fuel development. And then now we know since May 2021 that lately the IEA has been calling for more oil and gas development. And the IEA has said oil and gas development should come from places like Canada that are leaders on climate action, reducing emissions, and protecting the environment. Period, full stop. And I agree 1,000%. We have a record that we should be proud of. And this is where energy advocacy is very important. We need to get out there. We need to talk to our friends, our family, our neighbors, our colleagues, people at school, people on the street. That's why wearing the t-shirts are so important. It can start a conversation. We always keep those conversations, though, positive, respectful, inclusive, nonpartisan, and fact-driven. And if people want to debate and argue, like if you say 1 + 1 = 2 and someone wants to argue with you about that, maybe you should not spend any more time on that person, because you're probably not going to get too far. And when people are talking about shutting down oil and gas today, well, that's not reality. And when people are talking about going 100% renewable tomorrow, it's not reality. And when people talk about blocking Canadian pipelines, it's not helpful. The actions over the last decade to block Canadian pipelines has not reduced emissions. It has not kept oil or gas in the ground. It has not helped Canadian families. It has not promoted human rights awareness and leadership around the world. All it has done is it has helped other oil and gas producers. That is the truth. That is the cold, hard facts of the matter. And we see right now with what's happening around the world, coal use is at an all-time high. More coal-fired power plants are being built. If we had built Canadian LNG on the east and west coast, we could have also helped reduce some of that coal demand potentially with our abundant low-emission natural gas and liquefaction for LNG to Asia, and also on the east coast, helped potentially our partners and allies around the world. It is really important that we are having balanced conversations. There are more people that want to hold a sign that says shut it down than there are people who want to hold a sign like this. The economy and the environment must coexist, or else we all need to ask ourselves what we're willing to sacrifice. And if Canada sacrifices, is the rest of the world also going to sacrifice? We can have a bigger impact reducing coal demand by exporting LNG, being a leader in global discussions about ensuring that all oil and gas producers, all resource producers are looking at Canada's leadership as something to aspire to, as something to grow into. And that's why shutting down Canadian energy, blocking Canadian pipelines, opposing Keystone XL, Energy East. In 2011, there was 18 LNG projects planned in the country. Right now, there's one fully under construction and one starting construction. In that same time frame, Australia has become the world's largest LNG exporter, and the US has become one of the world's largest LNG exporters. A good example that we haven't reduced natural gas demand. All we have done is allowed other countries to benefit at Canada's expense and at the expense of the environment, because there's many other LNG producers around the world increasing their capacity, and they do not all have the same low emissions commitments and commitments to human rights, Indigenous partnerships, and climate action. We can see that this is what's happening in the world right now. I talked about the US and Australia, other countries increasing LNG export capacity, and other countries making tremendous investments in oil and gas production. I, as a Canadian, think that as long as the world needs oil and gas, it should be coming from Canada, because we are committed to climate leadership, environmental protection, upholding and being global leaders for social progress, governance, transparency, and protecting and promoting human rights. And I think those are really important values. And I know that when a company like Statoil in Norway, now called Equinor, when they sold their Alberta oil assets because of Greenpeace pressure, they operated in 30 countries around the world, but they were only pressured to sell Alberta. They then went and invested $10 billion in Brazil. They don't have the same transparency. They don't have the same commitments to climate action as we do in Alberta. There are a lot of examples where this has happened, the unintended consequences. And again, there's one single benefactor of pipeline obstructionism in Canada over the last decade, and that is other oil and gas producers. People are well-meaning, but we need to ensure through awareness and advocacy, through talking, through conversations, reducing polarization, that we're having conversations so we can all have a greater understanding. We can be pro-oil and pro-wind and pro-solar and pro-hydro and pro-natural gas at the same time, because we are all pro-electricity and natural gas to heat our homes and gasoline for our cars. We are pro-food in the grocery store. We are pro my phone works, my phone connects, I have Wi-Fi. There's all these things we take for granted. And that's the reality of reliable access to affordable energy. And we need to have an inclusive strategy. Canada is a global leader in reducing emissions. Canada is a global leader in non-emitting power generation from hydro, nuclear, growing solar, and other forms of power. Canada is a leader. I think we're 9th in the world for wind right now. Who knew? The first wind farm in Canada was in Alberta in 1993. And Alberta, currently home of the oil sands, has some of the largest solar and wind projects under construction in North America. And all energy systems, everything humans do has an environmental impact that includes wind and solar and includes oil and gas. It's about reducing those impacts and deciding, do you want the impacts to be in a country like Canada where we can see it, we're transparent, and we're trying to reduce it? Or do you want to simply give that production and the economic benefits to other countries that do not have those same commitments or values? And that's the reality. That's the pragmatic conversation that we need to be having. Leonardo DiCaprio, we know the guy likes private jets. He once did New Year's Eve in Australia, then flew to Vegas to do another New Year's Eve on a 747 that he had rented with some friends. Here's an example of the person on yachts and traveling around the world who wants to talk about shutting down Keystone XL and other environmental, he has other environmental commitments. A lot of these things are awesome. We need to support responsible forestry management. We need to support initiatives to reduce poaching and to save gorillas. There's lots of other really important things. But when it comes to Canadian energy, this has been like low-hanging fruit, a soft target, if you will. Oh, yay, we're all going to shut down Keystone. It's easy. We're all going to protest in the street. What does that mean? Since Keystone was first proposed, oil demand increased by 10 million barrels per day. The US was buying more oil from other countries with weaker climate commitments than Canada because we didn't have infrastructure. More oil ended up on rail, and other countries ultimately benefited. It did not keep a barrel of oil in the ground, but Leo got a good photo out of it, I guess. So we really do need to talk about pragmatism and the reality of how we all want to live, the actions we can all take to reduce consumption, protect the environment, but on a broader global picture, we need more Canada in the world. This is why we need more Canada in the world, and I've been talking about it. But when we look at the world's top exporters, Canada is #1 on all of these different independent, global NGO ranked indexes. I value the rule of law. I value transparency and reducing corruption. I value resource governance, democracy, the Women, Peace and Security Index, Human Freedom Index, Sustainable Development Index, Environmental Performance Index. These are really important. And I'm really proud that Canada is #1 when we look at the world's top 10 oil exporters. These are the other countries that stand to benefit the most and have benefited the most from keeping Canada out of that global competition. There are countries importing oil and gas that want to get more oil and gas from countries reducing their emissions. That's Canada. We need infrastructure to be able to export that low emission natural gas and that climate focused oil to global customers. And we need to make other countries compete with Canada on a global stage. This is, again, we don't want your dirty tar sands oil. There are some oil sands projects that have lower emissions than global averages. There is new technology in the oil sands every year reducing emissions further. We know that the actual highest emission production in North America comes from California. The highest emission production in the world comes from Nigeria. There's a lot of Nigerian oil imports that have come into Canada and come into other countries. And the people that organize the protest that you see in this photo, they're not doing the same type of organizing when it comes to stopping those tankers coming into Canada or elsewhere, Europe, the US, North America. And it doesn't help the environment. It actually doesn't. It just helps other countries. This is why we need to be advocates for a Team Canada approach. It's not East versus West. It's not wind versus oil, like I said. It's not us versus them. It's not rural versus urban. And it is not about excluding in any way, shape, or fashion these Indigenous communities who desperately want to be partners in responsible resource development so that they can improve their quality of living and have a future for their children. We need to get beyond these, the maple leaf covered in oil. That's ridiculous. It's they're attacking the flag essentially. And we know that Canada, of all the world's oil production, we're like 35 to 40% of the world's oil production that has carbon pricing. We've actually had carbon pricing initiatives on oil production in Alberta since 2007. That's 15 years ago. We've been leaders. We are leaders. We have more work to do, but we never stop trying to get better. That's the key thing. We are focused on continual improvement. Here's another example of why the world needs more Canadian energy and why we should be advocates for an informed, balanced conversation. The U of C did a study that showed if we took Canadian standards for flaring and methane and applied it internationally to all oil and gas producers, we would take the equivalent of about 100 million cars off the road. And the emissions, the upstream emissions from producing a barrel of oil would fall by almost a quarter. That's remarkable. If Greenpeace and these groups want to be balanced, they should be talking about Canada's record on wind. They should be talking about opportunities like this to reduce global emissions. They should be talking about organizing protests when there's oil tankers coming into Canada, North America, and Europe from other suppliers that do not have our same commitments to climate action. They should be more balanced, less polarizing, more approachable, and we need to all work together if we want to be honest and if we want to have the biggest net positive benefit on the world. This is why our advocacy matters. These are some ads that we ran years ago now. At one point, even though we had the most climate-focused oil and gas industry on earth of the top producers and exporters, our oil was selling at a $50 discount. We were selling the cheapest oil on earth with the highest focus on climate action. Those two things don't really reconcile. And that's because we didn't have pipelines like Keystone XL. So there's an impact to Canadian families. There's an impact to research and development budgets for continued innovation towards climate action, reducing emissions, and investments in other clean tech and green technologies, of which, when we're talking about clean tech and environmental protection, the oil and gas industry is the largest spender of any industry in the country. And these are important conversations. This is why we need to talk to people. This is why, again, the shirt matters. 5 minutes, a couple times a week, not just sharing headlines, but reading and understanding, deciding what in that article spoke to you. What did you find interesting, or what was new information? And then sharing that and starting a conversation with your friends on Facebook. Hey, I just learned this. What do you think? Being respectful, reducing polarization, and trying to live a glass half full life and mentality where we're living in abundance and we're trying to, converse with people rather than argue. And certainly there are people who want to argue, and we don't even know online sometimes if they're real people, if they could be bot accounts. So it's really important that we have some strict sort of policies, I guess, as individuals. We mute, block, and move on from conversations that don't seem to be constructive, respectful, or where people, you tell someone a fact and then they just immediately have another concern. You answer that, they don't acknowledge it, they have another concern. Maybe that's someone whose mind you can't change. That's okay. We still can have respectful conversations. We still can try to find common ground on some things. And at the end of the day, every time we get these facts out, we are helping more people understand, activating people who are pro-Canada, pro-Canadian resources, pro-environmental protection, pro-climate action, all those things, even if they don't always seem like they're one and the same, they are one and the same. And activating those people in conversations and educating everyone. Most people do not know enough about oil and gas. It's important that we're reaching our friends and our family outside of provinces where there's oil and gas production, just like it's important in forestry or in mining that we're reaching friends and family outside of those local jurisdictions where they don't know. People think that food comes from the grocery store. We all know that that's not true. People think energy comes from the light switch. That's not true. Heat just comes out of your vent. That's not true. These things are so complex, and it's really hard sometimes to make a complex topic a little bit more simple, but we can do that. Consistent effort, couple minutes, couple times a week, learning, sharing, putting a sticker on a laptop, starting conversations. There's lots of ways we can participate, sharing our thoughts on video or writing letters to an editor, respectfully using social media to let people know that sometimes, hey, this editorial you wrote wasn't factual. Here's the correction. The more feedback that people get when it's respectful and inclusive, the better I think we are all. We need to raise the level of decorum in our society, especially online. Talking again about why it's important that we are advocates for Canadian resources. The oil and gas industry specifically, it's over $500 billion to Canadian government since 2000, with more to come, a lot more to come. So when we think about social services, quality of living, healthcare, education, infrastructure, transit, all these different things are in part funded and contributed to by our resource industry. And as global oil and gas demand is back to record highs and is going to grow further, we need trillions of dollars of investment to maintain supply. Even when oil and gas demand peaks in 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 years, we're still going to be using it for another 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 years beyond. This investment should be happening in Canada. We should be asking the rest of the world to follow our example, where we can protect the environment and support our energy and resource economy at the same time. We can be proud of Canada's record. We can make sure that people are having conversations where they've had opportunities to learn the facts. Because oil and gas in Canada does support Canadian families. Like I've said about carbon pricing, like I've said about the innovation. I mean, we're the only place in the world that sent up a satellite to monitor emissions. We have the largest group of companies that's collaborating together to share technology to reduce environmental impacts. There's so many amazing examples of what we've been doing in our oil and gas industry. There's Canadians working all over the world, helping other countries develop oil and gas resources, and we are sharing our know-how, our energy regulation models, and a lot of this climate technology and innovation, the X Prize and other great examples, COSTIA, with the world. And we should be asking the world, you know what? We're going to try to meet growing global oil and gas demand. We're going to try to increase our market share. We know that consumers want lower emission choices. They still want the energy. So now you got to compete with Canada, because we can give them the energy at a cost competitive price, and we can show them that we've been reducing emissions. Have you been doing that? And that's a question that we can force other countries to have and to talk about. I think it's really important. When we talk about resources, we can't talk about resources without talking about Indigenous communities. And I think it's really important, as we are advocating for an informed, balanced, respectful conversation, we remember that specifically, we've seen a lot of conversation about Coastal GasLink, and we know that the facts are every Indigenous community on that project route supports the pipeline. There's many Indigenous people working on that project. There are many Indigenous companies working on that project. There are many Indigenous communities that are trying to develop their own natural gas and LNG projects. We need to ensure we're having a balanced conversation. What we can do is we can find the narratives, the voices, the people that maybe aren't getting heard as much, that maybe aren't in the media as much. Maybe they don't have a big Greenpeace machine behind them trying to promote them up and get them into the news or the media. We can find those people. We can share those narratives. We can ask people to consider other perspectives, like this perspective from Helen Michelle, one of many members of the Wet'suwet'en who does support Coastal GasLink. If you only watched some of those protests, well, you might think that it was an oil pipeline, not a natural gas pipeline. You might think that everyone was against it. Also not true. You might think that it was, done without any consultation. Again, not true. Years and years and years. Canada actually right now has had the longest regulatory timelines for energy infrastructure in the world ever, in the history of the world, with a lot of these projects. And it's really important as we move forward, we can continue to advocate for protecting the global environment, supporting Canadian families, partnerships with Indigenous communities, and the benefits that Canadians and the world stand to benefit. when a couple people hold up a sign like this, it's very emotional. It's also very inflammatory. It's also not accurate. It's also very misleading for a lot of the reasons we've talked about. Our oil and gas industry is focused on reducing emissions, protecting the environment, collaborating, and innovating to always get better. And this is a good example of a couple people with a sign, some well-placed media, and this can become a news story that then goes on to influence people's opinions that read that news story. There could be 2 or 3 or 5 people here. We know from polling, a majority of Canadians support Canadian energy with our continued commitment to environmental protection and leadership. A majority of Canadians want global oil and gas demand and growing demand and remaining demand to be met by Canada with our world-leading commitments to environmental protection, Indigenous partnerships, good social protections, and transparency. There's a lot that we can do. It's having these conversations, it's sharing things on social media, it's writing letters, it's sending emails, it's conversing with friends and family. The key, though, to all of that is to keep it, like I said, positive, respectful, inclusive, fact-driven, and nonpartisan. It doesn't matter who you vote for, 1 + 1 = 2. It doesn't matter who you vote for, the world needs more Canadian resources and more Canadian energy. And it doesn't matter where you live or what you believe, these conversations need to remain respectful and inclusive. So we can find things that we agree on, some common ground, even if we agree to disagree on other things at times. We need to raise the level of decorum online. We need to be nicer to people. And we need to ensure that other countries with weaker standards do not continue to benefit at Canada's expense and at the environment's expense because of protests like this. Very inflammatory, incendiary language around crime and the climate. Again, we all want to protect the climate. Canada is a leader in protecting the climate. We are focused on continuing to reduce our emissions. And we have among the best levels of transparency, human rights protections in the world of all oil and gas producers, if you want to talk about crime. So again, here's an example of why we need to be advocates, why we need to reach out and talk to more young people, why the world needs to hear our voices and what we think as we go forward. That is the end of my slide deck. I hope that it was enjoyable. And I really just want to extend my appreciation to everyone that's a part of SFC, all Canadians who are working hard to feed their families in all industries and in all sectors. And as we move forward, we need to come together as a country, as a world, reduce polarization, be nicer to each other, and have honest conversations that are devoid of those inflammatory banners and signs, those media stunts. We need to talk about the reality of who benefits when Canada doesn't produce its resources and doesn't export those resources to the world. And we need to just make our voices heard. I think as people see, every time someone sees someone in a shirt that says, "I love Canadian wind," they go, "Yeah, you know what? I love Canadian wind too." And when they see someone in a shirt that says, "I love oil sands," they go, "Yeah, you know what? My brother used to work up there." And I've seen photos, and wow, they're really reclaiming the land that they disturbed. And did you know that when that project is done, you won't even know it was there? I wonder if we're going to do that to our cities. I don't know. I don't think so. So there's just a lot more that needs to happen, a lot more of a conversation that needs to happen. And it's important people know they're not alone. They're part of a broader community. And I just really commend everyone for being a part of SFC. It's such an important initiative. And congratulations to all of you students and young Canadians for your participation in a conversation that has not been happening about the other side to those banners, the other side, what happens in the world, what's the unintended consequence, what's going on globally, the macro, the big picture. It's really important. Thank you.